going to go through, I'm going to talk about in the second section, I'm going to talk about effective responses. Yeah, so like I mentioned at the start, one of the things that we try to do is to not get stuck in negating the negative. Somebody has to negate it, but to not see that as sufficient, right? You know, for me, key approaches are trying to understand who's setting the agenda when we're negating the negative. It's not us, right? We're defending, and in some regard, we need to be a lot more proactive and putting the stories we want out there and take back some of this middle ground, right? And this is where my phrase, the rebalancing or changing the weather comes in, right? Other stories are needed, right? And we have to find some and get back to some sort of positivity here. And for me, it's important to negate, someone has to do it, but actually trying to rebalance as well, you know, to find and rebuild support around more diversity or inclusion messages. We need to expand the base, but we also need to reduce anxiety around the middle, right? And this is the kind of thing that we're thinking about here. So, and proactively deciding to go out there and do something about it. So this comes to this notion then of we have to tell our own stories. We have to get back to positive. We have to support people who are negating, but also get out there and try and tell some different stories. In the work that we did in the Narrative Change Lab, one of the things that we were trying to achieve was trying to take on more what we call skeptical audiences, right? So this picture that I'm putting in front of you is a very simple overview, but the simple message here is that actually we need a much more complicated view of the public when it comes to migration debate. And this research shows that oftentimes in many countries around Europe and the States, or whatever, that it isn't as simply polarized as we think of it, right? That actually there will always be kind of far right, really anti people and really pro people, but this kind of 15, 67 or 60/70 is really quite a standard kind of thing when it comes to this debate. So this was our challenge in the lab as well. How do we reach to those movable, mushy, whatever they're called, kind of middle groups? Just to be really clear here, we're not trying to turn them into supporters. We're trying to reduce anxiety. We're even trying to somewhat kind of, people have called it, stabilize the middle, kind of, you know, push back a little bit to a certain extent so that those kinds of populist narratives are not so resonant there. So it's not a conversion project, right? So that's an important thing. Yeah, just to show you, it took quite a long time, this process here, where there was lots of people working on this issue and trying to come up to speed with this kind of reframing approaches. But it took time to actually get here, okay? It took a bit of a community to get this whole thing going, actually. And what we were trying to do was work together a little bit around try to find people who are willing and interested to talk to these middle groups, but also trying to expand the community of people who recognize that strategic comms or these kinds of responses are very important in this regard. Okay, so let me tell you the story of this campaign that we did together with this organization called JUMA. Yeah, JUMA is a small, basically it's a youth empowerment project. So young people from a Muslim background. It's not a religious project, it's a civic, so people who are recognized as Muslims in Germany. And what they're trying to do, as I say here, is to support and empower their members. And actually one of the things that inspired them to get involved in this was their members could actually feel on the street that the public debate was changing, right? So where did we start? We started with trying to understand the public debate at that time in 2017. So I mentioned this organization called More in Common. They did this attitude-based research that basically tried to break out the different segments of the population in Germany and try and understand them a lot better. So in the project that we worked on, we were trying to tackle these two groups, or we were trying to target these two groups, so-called economic pragmatists and skeptical moralists. You could see here that makes up 40% of the population, so really significant. So like the possibility to rebalance is really there if we could actually engage these groups here. You can see here we get an idea of their positions, their key positions on issues here, and then also we have an understanding of the demographics and also other important characteristics. This was very important for us in the Narrative Change Lab to try to get our people to sort of dig into these kinds of ideas as we go down the line. We actually, in the Narrative Change Lab, we tried to personify the middle. Like we got people to draw, we tried role playing, and trying to get to this point where we try to take the people we're trying to engage with, not leave them as research subjects, but actually the people, try to think of them much more and what's the kind of emotional arc of their story. So this kind of trying to sort of understand a lot more the people and what makes them tick, and back to that notion of frames, it was really key in trying to dig down deep into understanding middle groups and what makes them tick. Yeah, and ultimately what we came down to then was this research. You can try and understand what are the values that they say are important, that they're trying to put forward in this debate, right? Then the other key thing is, of course, we're not asking people. This isn't a kind of manipulation sellout project. We have got to find what's called this famous overlapping value space, right? One of the kind of 12 keys is this idea that values unite and issues divide, right? And what does that mean? It means that actually, if we're able to find a kind of overlapping value space that allows us to begin a debate, we could open a conversation with a group of people who might be skeptical. This does not mean that you avoid the difficult conversations. It means you bring them to the table rather than pushing them away from the table, right? And that's a key thing here. It's the sequencing part that's very important. As part of this process for an organization like Juma, the value space they're also willing to talk to is very important here, because it's not enough to just adopt the values of others. You have to be authentic messengers. You have to be honest in the way you talk about this, right? So if you start effective communication, then one of the things that you're trying to get to is, people will want to talk to you then after that, right? You have to have the space to tell the story. Then last but not least, obviously, you're normally targeting some sort of event or debate, right? So thinking about where these things overlap and finding a value space will bring you to, hopefully, a kind of resonant message space. Okay, this is very meta at the moment, but let me show you what this resonant message space was for Juma. You can see here what they tried to literally look at was the notion of humanity was important. This idea of like youth and future was important, and this is again in the overlap. Community contribution, teamwork, and also this notion of humanity that we're trying to appeal to here. They could see that in the debate in Germany around that time, and basically, there's just two polarized ideas that you're trying to log onto. And, you're either very much for these communities or you're very against these communities. And what they could actually see was that as colleagues, as workmates, as teammates, as, everyday normal things happen, right? And they don't fit into those debates that are going on. So this was the idea in this campaign. How can we talk about like our lives and the lives of our communities in a way where it's like we bring down the anxiety, we bring down the tension. Obviously, this idea of tradition is an important one to talk about here. The value appeal of tradition. Tradition can be a very exclusive rather than inclusive idea, right? And we debated a lot about this idea of how to appeal to notions of tradition. And the idea was to try and find a way in where it was not trying to repeat negative stories around tradition, but overlaps, where tradition is a stepping stone to talk about shared humanity and shared values. Okay, but we were really aware of the danger of that as a value appeal. So this was the overall strategy within this campaign. Differences exist, but we share values, experiences, and emotions on every day, right? And we should celebrate these connections. The idea of the campaign was also to roll it out around, there's a thing called the Day of German Unity, which is on October 3rd. So the unity idea was there for their event too. And the approach was to do this thing, kind of what they called a show not tell approach, demonstrating rather than discussing. And the idea was to identify protagonists and tell stories like real people, different backgrounds who believe in Islam and have their roots in Germany. Okay, so trying to put just these really kind of, I think, relatively normal stories out there, see how people respond. So this was the top line of this work. We did a lot of testing as we went along, and maybe this is also a message for you guys. Oftentimes we need to not trust our instincts. So the thing that we did was, after we built out a first draft of the elements of this campaign, first of all, we did what we call concept testing. We ran focus groups, right? We wanted to make sure that the basic idea or concept of the campaign in and of itself was something that middle groups understood or got, or how they reacted. So what we did was we got the campaigners to develop the campaign concepts on one page and also first draft visuals. What we did was we tried to sort of sketch out the ideas first, right? And then test them before we invested the money. And we ran focus groups with yeah, 2 groups of humanitarian skeptics and 2 groups of economic pragmatists. And campaigners observed 8 hours of focus groups. And we were able to see that the middle really existed. And this idea of their responses wasn't just a research idea. And it was really mobilizing for the group. Just to show you, this is one interesting example. The rough image here, we tested that in focus groups with both economic pragmatists. And what did the first picture trigger for middle groups? The thing that we didn't expect at all, they literally saw the Mediterranean crossing. The protagonist they were thinking of was a woman who, and you'll see, there she is in the second draft, she's a doctor, and you'll see her video, but part of her hobbies is to be a rower. But this is the value of testing in a certain level here. So you can see that once we got feedback here, so you could see that then in the actual draft that we use, we changed the whole perspective, right? And the photographers and the creatives, we wanted to still talk about this woman's life outside of like her work, and so we didn't have this idea then of trying to trigger the Mediterranean thing, but that's a useful example. One of the first examples we got from Getty Images. This second image we got was literally a photo that was taken by one of the groups who are from Stuttgart, and this was their mates having a bit of a laugh on the trampoline, and this was a photo from a phone, right? And the idea of this obviously was this is appealing to the kind of youth idea, right? And they were also trying to use, this is kind of interesting, they were trying to use local dialect actually to try to appeal to an idea of that these people are really obviously we are very much part of the place they're from. Okay, the response, especially with the humanitarian skeptics, was nobody believed that this picture was true. So what do we take away from this? We took away that actually there's something there's a very strong response to hijabi women, right? And also the symbol of the hijab as a cultural moment here. This picture was too dissonant for them. And all the time, like we're trying to find, and this is another one of our cards, in these messages, you've got to find the balance between what we call resonance and dissonance, so that people see something, they go, yeah, that makes sense in a way, but also asks me a question. So this was a very key line in trying to understand how these groups went along. These are 2 things that the first one we could see we needed to change the focus, so not to trigger this Mediterranean. The second one was we knew that the picture in and of itself was kind of too strong, or I don't know, too dissonant in some ways, but we still wanted to take forward the idea. The third one, this was one that really worked well. Okay, again, a kind of crappy first draft, but we could see that notion of kind of contribution and community really did work well and tested really well with these middle groups. So this, you can see that we go from the focus groups and the testing, we understand a lot better what the triggers are, right? And then this allows us, then you could see that we went in a different direction, not a different direction, but ultimately we learned a lot from where to go. Okay, so we ended up with three protagonists, and in this campaign the campaigners wanted to show both their kind of people's professional lives and their free time. They're not just to say that they're well integrated people, but also like they're living here, and living together. So what we did here, you can see, was we tested different slogans, right, on the same poster. And you can try and figure out what works on this, okay? So this is an example of what we did concept testing, but we also did content testing. There were, all we were testing at the start was, did people get it? Did they buy it? Did they understand it? At this point, we're testing the real kind of campaign materials at the end. In terms of our kind of depolarization idea, what we were trying to do with movable middle audiences, as I said, we saw that it wasn't all negative here, and that's a key thing about understanding middle audiences. They're so-called biconceptuals, meaning that they hold things that really don't go together in the same mindset. So the target audience for this were what were called economic pragmatists, who, for example, really appreciate that migration adds to diversity, but they're skeptical about whether people can integrate at the same time, right? So we were trying to think about how do we reduce the kind of anxiety that they have on the one side and also increase their favorability. So it's not just about those questions. And you could see, honestly, it really worked. The question that came up to me all the time was, the thing that I think a little bit is that middle audiences are being asked to choose between 2 quite more radical ideas and quite polarized ideas, and they don't see a space where it reduces some sort of anxiety around it, where we can bring people back. So I think that like just these kind of more normal stories, I think that there is an anxiety aspect of it that that we need to address in this regard. Just to be clear here, last thing, this campaign was a pilot. We really had some limitations in terms of budget and also in terms of capacity of the organization. There wasn't much media response, but actually we really didn't invest in this. The idea of this pilot campaign was just try to put together messages that would work and test that, and see if we could build messages that would work within this regard here. The next phase that we would go to would be to get positive responses in the valued media spaces of the middle.